Well, welcome. It's a great honor for us to have Professor Solimano today with us, and thank you all for coming. Today's presentation is going to be about inequality elites in Latin America. Professor Solimano, as probably you all know, is a very well-renowned heterodox economist, has published a long list of publications about a wide range of topics from inequality, elites, economic development, problems of structural transformation in Latin America. So I think it's going to be a very challenging and exciting presentation. Professor Solimano, thank you for coming. The presentation is going to last 45 minutes approx. We have certain flexibility, and then we'll have like 20 minutes for questions and answers. Okay, so Professor, thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Miguel. I will here. Okay, well, I'm happy to be at Cambridge tonight. Came all the way from Oxford, staying now until December. So my presentation will be about the relationship between inequality, the social structure, in particular the role of elites, economic elites, and try to apply this framework to the Latin American experience with inequality and the relative weight of elites, and to what extent elites shape the inequality problem in the region. Well, the motivation is that, one of the motivations that inequality of income, wealth, opportunities, power, different dimensions of inequality, when it exceeds certain limits or certain range, it becomes a problem, both an economic problem, a political problem, can be also a moral problem or ethical problem. So inequality matters for different reasons, in terms of implication on social justice, ethics, social cohesion in general. We think that societies with a high degree of inequality undermine the degree of cohesion that any well-structured society has to show. And also inequality is a source of concern in terms of the impact, the potentially adverse impact it may have on economic growth, the sustainability of growth, social stability, political stability, etc. Well, let me turn to what could be thought as the evolution of inequality at a global level, and then try to boil it down to the case of Latin America. I will present some evidence on the social structure in the 21st century, or in 21st century capitalism, evidence on inequality, evidence on the evolution of economic elites, the middle class, and the traditional working class. Then I will turn to the Latin American situation. In general, what we do observe is that in the last 20, 30 years, main economies or big countries like the US, the UK, Russia, China, other, that have followed some sort of free market policies or neoliberal model, have experienced at the same time an increase in inequality. The starting conditions, of course, were different. This process started with the Thatcher Revolution in the UK, Reagan Revolution in the US, and then in the other part of the world, in Russia with the end of the communist system, and in China with the metamorphosis of the Communist Party in power, but with an economic system that could be classified as state capitalism or neo-capitalism or communist capitalism. I mean, there is a variety of ways to characterize it. So, in general, we observe that in these economies and other, there has been an increase in inequality measured by, let's say, the Gini coefficient and other measures. Then we observe that in the case of Latin America, there is a complex picture of what has been the recent evolution of inequality. Some people are claiming that inequality is declining in the Latin American region, particularly based on household survey data and or Gini coefficients using survey data. But there is new evidence using tax data, tax information, that shows that the decline in inequality may not be true or may be smaller than thought. Also, at the level of the OECD, the Latin American countries that are members of the OECD, like Chile, Mexico, are the countries that have the highest levels of inequality, besides the US, which is a developed economy, but part of the OECD economy, and Turkey, which is not the Latin American economy, but it's also a relatively high income developed country, or high middle income. Okay? Then I will show some evidence on the distribution of wealth. Okay? One of my points is that we have to look at wealth as well as income if we want to have a more complete picture of the situation of inequality and the social structure. And then there is another argument made by some people, is that global inequality, rather than increasing, has been declining if we consider the fact that, let's say, two big economies like China and India have been growing at fast, rapid rates in the last 20 years or so, and there is a convergence in per capita income levels with advanced mature capitalist economies like the US and others. So if we take the global distribution of income, not only the distribution of income at national level, but also the distribution of income between countries, not only within, but between, we see a process of convergence. Very much concentrated in India and China, but since those two economies amount to 2.5 billion people, it's an important trend that we have to consider. Okay, so the global picture in terms of inequality of income is mixed, but I think in general there is a tendency for inequality to have increased in the last 2 or 3 decades. Well, now, in terms of the social structure underlying or accompanying the change in inequality, we can highlight 3 stylized facts. One is the strengthening of economic elites and the rise of the super rich. We'll show some measure of that in terms of the increase in the income shares of the top 1% or top 5%, and some data on the wealth share of the top percentiles of the distribution. Okay, so I think one important feature of the neoliberal period, the neoliberal era, or the last 20, 30 years, is that the economic power, so to speak, or the concentration of economic resources in elites has increased. Then we have a second part of the social structure, which is the middle class. Okay, there are many problems, practical problems, conceptual problems to define what is the middle class. In general, if you use surveys and you go and ask people what is the social class that you do belong, or you believe you belong, 95% of the people will say I am a middle class individual. Few are afraid to say I'm rich or I'm very wealthy. Another group also are hesitant to declare themselves, well, I'm poor, I am working class, etc. It has changed over time, etc. But in general, the self-representation of people in general is dominated by the idea that everybody is in some way a middle class. Then economists have tried to measure the middle class using deciles, let's say from the 30 side to the 90 side, or $10, the range of $10 to $50 per day, like the World Bank, etc., to get a quantitative measure of the middle class. In general, the point I want to highlight is that in some countries, the size of the middle class, the absolute size of the middle class has expanded. Because in countries like China, India, even Latin America in the last 10, 15 years, many people have left poverty and they have entered to a new social status that one may say is middle class. There is controversy to what extent the transition is immediately from poverty to middle class, or whether you are in some hybrid class, could be termed the vulnerable class, or a class that is lower middle class, closer to poverty, etc. But in general, we see that there is a change in the number of people in the middle class, but also fragmentation of the middle class. I developed that in a book. Jose Miguel has it. I didn't bring a copy, but for those that are interested, I use some free publicity of the book with the help of my friend Jose Miguel. But for those that are interested in reading more, the book is called Economic Elites, Crisis and Democracy.
Alternatives beyond neoliberal capitalism.
Yes, alternatives beyond neoliberal capitalism. Yes. And there is a chapter devoted to the middle class, and there is another chapter devoted to elites. If you want to read more on this. But in general, the point that is made in the book is that the middle class may have expanded, but at the same time, it has fragmented or have differentiated within the middle class. We have an upper middle class that can be managers, can be professional, MBAs, lawyers, medical doctors, people that in general do well in the labor market. And then we have a more traditional middle class that could be people in the state sector, in ministries, public sector agencies, teachers from public schools, whose salaries have not increased that much, and that have lagged vis-a-vis the successful lawyer, the successful MBA, the successful architect, the guy that is moving up very fast in a corporation, to be upper middle class. So within the middle class there are differentiations. And then there is a third tier of the social structure that I think is important to, is the traditional working class, the manual working class, the proletariat, what was understood as now everybody thinks that there is a whole literature saying that the working class has disappeared. Well, I think it's an exaggeration in the sense that for working class we mean people that make a living out of a salary and is part of a hierarchical structure that has a boss, has to comply with hours when they go to office. Many people still are middle class. Middle class is part of working class. Therefore, but in terms of the traditional working class tied to the industrial sector, we see a decline in the importance, relative importance of the traditional working class. So these are the three stylized facts that I want to. Here are some numbers. For example, for the elites, this is the top income, the top 1% income share in English-speaking countries. This is where the English-speaking countries, and so it would be relevant to read this information here. Here you have the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, the US. If you are smart enough to be able to read the chart, you will see that more or less this chart goes from 1913 to 2013, 100 years, 101 years. But you will see that roughly in around the mid to late 80s, we observe an increase in the relative share with ups and downs of the top 1%. The increase is more sharp. It's the sharpest in the US. And also you observe, let me see the UK, if I can read here. Also the UK, then there's a flattening, a reduction. But if you compare with the interwar period, which was a period where there was a tendency to decline the income share, here is a turning point and a movement toward an increase in this set of countries. So that's an evidence that economic elites, which is more a sociological concept But they can be correlated with economic measures, statistical measures like the top income share, having the elites have increased their economic importance, approximated by this measure. Then, if we jump to this, by the way, that trend is not that sharp for continental Europe and Japan. These numbers come from the the top income, the World Top Income Database of the Paris School of Economics, of Piketty and his associates. You can download the series, everything is presented there in a very accessible fashion. Probably you have used that data already. You can play with different countries. For developing countries also, we can do that. I have the another book I'm writing on this, I put developing countries to the extent that the developing countries are available. And you can track what happened with the topic question. Well, this second chart refers to the middle class. And basically what I do here is I put in the horizontal axis the share, here it's in Spanish, but the share of the middle class defined as the percentage of the population between the third decile, the 30%, the poorest 30% is out, and the top 10% is out too. What is in between is the middle class. Different ranges of the middle class again. And I correlate it with the Gini index for income. Here, the blue dotted points and the red points are here. And you see in general, well, the R-square is 90% for income, and the R-square for wealth is 48%. The relationship is stronger when we correlate income, the Gini and the share of the middle class, and we correlate wealth. Okay? You see the relation line is here, and also the variance or the dispersion with respect to the line is much higher for wealth. But the important point is that there is a negative relationship between the two dimensions. The point I want to make here is basically, yes, economic growth per se tend to increase the absolute size of the middle class. So people leave poverty and go to a new segment, which can be termed middle class. That's fine. But if the economic growth come along with an increase in inequality of income or wealth, that has an adverse effect on the middle class, because we detect a negative relationship between the size of the middle class and inequality. So, for example, China has been growing, not in the last 2 years, but before, at a rate of near 9% or 10% per period. So, some 300 million people have left poverty. That's fine. But the Gini coefficient went from around 25% in the Maoist period to 46% now, a very big jump in inequality. So, true, a new Chinese middle class has been created, but that middle class is differentiated, etc., fragmented because of the increase in inequality that has come along with growth. And that can be extended to other countries as well. And here, related to the idea of a working class squeeze, I present the labor share for the US, Japan, China, and Germany, 4 main economies. And all of these economies, depends on the period, the US will have data of the last 40 years, 75 to 2015. China will have a smaller period here. Germany, from the early 80s, more or less up to now, 75 to 2012. In Japan, in all the 4 economies, the labor share in national income has been declining. So that's another evidence for the idea that there is a squeeze on the middle class. So keep in mind these 3, I will say laws, in some interpretation of 3 stylized facts. Income and wealth are distributed to the top of distribution, a complex story for the middle class with several qualifications, but there could be a lagging middle class in some countries, and then a clear marginalization of the traditional working class. That's what I think. Well, now, yes?
So what was the definition of the working class? It's just the lowest 30%?
No. that's another point. I mean, there are several definitions of the working class, but the labor share,
Oh, okay, yeah.
this
So
is
it's
the
from-
labor
yeah,
share.
okay.
Yeah, the share of wages, time, salary, employment divided by national income.
But so you have a huge overlap between middle class and your.
There is an overlap. At least one portion of the middle class,
Yeah.
on the lower portion of the middle class. Yes, yes. There is, you know, in national accounts there is a tricky point regarding self-employment or independent entrepreneurs, which are neither capitalists or capital owners, nor pure workers. They're self-employed. So it depends how you allocate the two. But here is just wage earners, the share of the income of wage earners over national income. That's the share. By the way, part of the increase in the share of the top 1% corresponds, and I have been showing data for the US and the UK, and other countries as well, correspond to compensation of CEOs, which strictly speaking are still labor. I mean, a CEO is hired by a company. The board of directors write down a contract. They have to receive a salary. Part of their income is like stock options, profit shares, bonuses, etc. So it's a mix of capital income and labor income. Those remunerations have increased, have exploded also in the last 20 years. That's part of the story of the increase in the top 1%. So the labor share here captured that too, but in spite of that, the overall tendency is for decline. Okay, let me. Well, here some data of the Gini coefficient, just reinforcing the idea that in economies like the US and the UK, the Gini has been in an upward trend in the last 40 years or so. Higher, the level is higher in the UK, in the US, sorry, in the United States. It's more unequal income distribution in the US than in the UK, but the tendency is there. And then we have inequality in Russia and China, the Gini coefficients for the two countries. You see that at the end of the socialist period, there was a big jump in the Gini coefficient from around 25% in 1988 to near 50% in 93. Okay, and then it has remained with some ups and downs fairly high. Okay, China the same thing. In 85 the Gini was 30%, a little bit over 30%. Now it's around 45%. Big increases for the Gini. The Gini is not. Okay. Well, here just numbers that just to introduce the wealth dimension. The wealth Gini coefficient for the US, the UK, Russia, and China are in the range between 73 to 90%, extremely high in Russia. In general, the Gini for wealth is higher than the Gini for income. Okay, and the numbers. Okay, let's turn to Latin America. So, I mean, the big point, the main point is inequality in main economies of the world has been increasing. And also we see these changes in the social structure along with the change in inequality. Now let's see within this global context what is happening in the Latin American region. Well, here I would like to show you this table. This table compares the OECD, Latin America, and the world average. Gross income, disposable income, and wealth. Okay? Just to situate the Latin American situation in a comparative perspective with, well, you know, gross income is equal by definition to market income plus transfers of the government. Okay? Disposable income corrects for taxes. And here we have wealth. Wealth is the sum of financial wealth plus non-financial wealth. Well, the Latin American, the story is, roughly speaking, inequality of income is much higher in Latin America than the OECD and in the world, but the difference is not that large when we consider gross income. 53%, the OECD is 47%. 6 percentage point of difference. Still, the difference is much higher for the world Gini, which is around 160 countries using the world data, the data from the World Bank. But the differences are more striking when we compare disposable income in the OECD with Latin America and the world. Okay, so and the difference also between the Gini of gross income and disposable income is not that high in the Latin American region. What does this suggest? Well, I would say is that the tax system is fairly ineffective to alter income distribution in Latin America. It may be due to the level of taxes and the composition of taxes, but the tax system doesn't change too much the distribution of income in the Latin American region. Whereas in the OECD, the tax system makes a big difference because the Gini goes down from 47% to 32%, some 15 percentage points of difference. That's very wealth, again, here it's interesting that the difference in wealth, yes, Latin America is not very different from the distribution of the world, the distribution of wealth at the global level, world average, but it's still higher than the Gini of wealth for the OECD. Well, here I have some pictures that can illustrate the difference. Look at the ratio of the tax revenues in Latin America compared with the OECD. The blue line is Latin America, the purple line is the OECD. So you see that the level of tax collection in the Latin American region is much lower than the level of tax collection in the OECD country. Therefore, the ability to finance a higher level of transfers, which make an important difference in income distribution, is much more reduced in the Latin American region. And here also some differences. Let me show you. Well, some explanation why this is the situation. I mean, we see that there is a part of the differences in inequality in the Latin American region vis-a-vis OECD and the world has to do with the fiscal system, both on the taxation side and social expenditure. And one thing is that the overall level of taxation as a share of GDP is much lower in Latin America than in the OECD. Second, the importance of direct taxation, which is more progressive than indirect taxation, is much lower in Latin America than the OECD. Third, social spending in general is relatively fragmented or is not universal in the European sense, whereas in the OECD you have university educational benefits more or less equal for everybody in society, health, etc. But now it's changing, but the difference in social spending patterns. And 2 or 3 hypotheses that have been put forward why this is the situation is that economic elites in the Latin American region are very powerful and they have managed to block attempts at redistributing income through higher level of taxation. Okay? So the fact that elites are important and powerful economically and politically accounts for the fact that the tax system and the transfer system is not very progressive. Okay? Now let me switch now. Well, here just to show something that I already said. Here you have the Gini coefficient and the ratio of the top 10 to the bottom 90% for the OECD, and again Chile and Mexico are show much higher levels of inequality than the rest, higher Gini coefficient and higher ratio between top and bottom. Okay, that's more or less in line with the data. Well, let's see what happened with the evolution. Now the discussion was more on levels. Now let's turn to the evolution. Here I want to show you this set of graphs. Here we have 9 economies in in the Latin American region that account for near 90% of the GDP of the region. And we plot two indicators. The blue line is GDP, actually the logarithm, the natural logarithm of GDP per capita, and the red line is the Gini coefficient for the period from 1950 to 2010, but really the numbers start around the 1970s, 80s, because that's when household surveys started to be collected in more regular fashion in the region. These are the Gini coefficients calculated out of household surveys. Okay, that's very important qualification. Well, we see that in the last 10 years, there is a tendency for the Gini to decline in Argentina, more the stable, decline in Peru, decline in Brazil, Ecuador decline, Uruguay, Chile, Mexico, Venezuela. More or less everywhere the Gini coefficients are going down, coinciding with a period of more rapid economic growth in between, let's say, 2003, 4, 2012. Okay, so that has led to people, economic analysts and observers, to claim that income distribution has improved in the Latin American region in the last 10 years, 12 years or so. Okay. The question, is that true? Is a robust result? Is the region experiencing a decline in inequality in a world that in almost everywhere inequality is going up? Or at least in North America, in the US, inequality has been increasing. So in Latin America, a traditionally very unequal region, inequality is declining. Inequality is going up in the former socialist countries, in part of Europe, etc. But so the Latin American region would be a kind of outlier. That's the question. And some papers have been written and books in that perspective. Well, the data. This is what the data shows. Okay. The problem is that using household expenditure surveys has some limitations. Okay, particularly the fact that incomes reported by the top decile or the top 5%, top 1% tend to be underestimated. Okay, because if somebody is coming to your household and asks you your income, people in rich households or people belonging to high-income families, high-income individuals, may be reluctant to disclose their level of income. Or maybe the interviewer comes and say, okay, please talk to the nanny because the household heads are busy or they are not at home. So maybe that they are not obtaining the most accurate reporting. Okay. Also, people may be embarrassed. Somebody very rich may be embarrassed to reveal his or her income level. And also the guy may say, well, I don't know if this is a just interviewer or maybe somebody from the tax revenue service, whatever. So better to play safe and not disclose the real data. So that's an important consideration. Now, some researchers have started to compute using an alternative methodology, top income shares and Gini coefficients for the Latin American region, following more or less the methodology of Piketty and his associates, which is basically the main difference is discard household surveys and start using data coming from the internal revenue service of the tax authorities of each country. To the extent the tax authority disclose their database and put the database available for these researchers. That's particularly complicated in the Latin American region, but not impossible. I mean, tax authorities are more forthcoming, let's say, in Europe or the US to share their data than in the Latin American region. That is fine. But some brave researchers have managed to get that data. And here I present the income share of the top 1% in selected countries. Unfortunately, the series are not very complete. These are the series from the World Top Income Database. In Argentina, it stops in 2004. Brazil, 2012. Uruguay, 2012. Chile, there are a couple of studies that compute the number, 2009, 2010. Well, the fact is that when you compare the income share using household surveys with the income share of the top 1% using tax-based data, the income share with the tax data tend to be systematically higher than the income share using household surveys. That's one point. Here also, let me say before showing the case of Uruguay where the data has been processed in that direction. Chile is a country where the income share of the top 1% is the highest among the 5 countries that are portrayed in this chart, in this table. Okay, higher than Brazil and Colombia, which are also relatively high. Uruguay and Argentina have relatively lower top income shares. Okay. Now, if we use the case of Uruguay, we can replicate a relatively similar table for the other countries, and we'll find the difference that I just mentioned between calculating the income shares of the Gini using household surveys and comparing the income and the Gini using tax data. So the income share of the top 1% here and the Gini here. Household surveys in this column and tax data just for 3 years that the paper, the people that did this calculation is published, it's on the reference, are available. Let's say 11.5% versus 13.8, 10.2%, 14.3%, 9.3%, 14.1%. This is based on tax data. So we see that the household survey may underestimate by 2 to 3 or maybe near 5 percentage points the top income share. There is a formula, there is an algebraic expression derived by an Argentinian economist that worked with Alvarado, that works with Piketty, and actually the formula was derived by Tony Atkinson, at Oxford University, a world expert on income distribution, that shows that the true Gini, if the data underestimate the income share of the top 1%, the Gini coefficient, the true Gini, the Gini that measures the real or the true income distribution, tends to be lower than if we have the full information on top income share. So this matters for the Gini. And here you see the difference. 51% with the household survey, 54% with tax data, 49%, 53%, 48 versus 52. So once you start recalculating the data on income distribution, replacing household surveys for tax data, we see that both the level and also the evolution of income distribution start to change. So this casts doubts to the claim that income distribution has been improving in the Latin American region. That's the main conclusion that I think is important for you to keep in mind. Okay? Now the same table could be calculated for Colombia, for Brazil. There are at least 4 or 5 empirical studies for the countries that are in the other table that recalculate the shares and recalculate the Gini and show either that the Gini has not been declining, or if it has declined, the decline is much smoother. Look at here, from 54 to 52, yeah, it declines 2 percentage points, but here from 51 to 48 is 3. That's a difference. Yes?
Yeah, is it possible to establish trends because the time frame are very short?
Yes.
2009, 2011.
Yeah.
Whereas in the other was from 75.
Yes. Well, the study, that's a good question. The study for Brazil present data from 1928 with some gaps in between to 2012. I didn't have time to collect the data here and present in the PowerPoint. But then you have a longer, you can calculate, I mean, you can compare more or less the same time period when you have household surveys and tax data, and then see to what extent it's not just a matter of 2-3 years, but a more systematic. This is ongoing work. I mean, it's still not completely, I mean, but the tendency, I mean, but making these recalculations show that the income shares and the Gini are higher, have to be revised upwards. Yeah, but I think it's a relevant point. Well, let me turn to wealth distribution. Okay, and look at the numbers. Well, here just for you to give a glance of the order of magnitude of the wealth Gini coefficient. Here the data comes from a publication that you may know. It's called Global Wealth Report, produced by the Credit Suisse in Switzerland. But this report is directed by two experts on wealth distribution. Tony Shorrocks, who was from the London School of Economics, and James David from the University of Ontario in Canada, that have been working for years and years on wealth distribution. So these guys were hired by Credit Suisse, they direct the report, and they produce data that is comparable internationally according to the same methodology. Still, wealth data for some countries, if you go to the report, they grade countries according to the quality of the wealth data. Some countries are better and some countries are worse. In Latin America, the database in Latin America is not particularly good in all countries, but for example, Chile is reasonably accurate. It's produced by the central bank. In Brazil, and then you can get an idea of it. It's not that different. The difference is not huge. Well, let me show you some data. Here we calculate, and these numbers are also from the publication. 2 columns. The percentage change of the top decile, the top 10%, and the percentage change in the wealth shares of the top percentile, the top 1%. Okay? In the period 2000-2014, making a breakdown 2000-2008, the year of the global financial crisis, 2008-2014, for a set of countries. In red, yeah, you can see Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, the American countries, and the other countries from other regions, from Europe. Well, look at the increase in the wealth share of the top 1% in Argentina in the period 2008-2014, 60%, extremely high. In Brazil, 18%. In Chile, 27%. Colombia, it's a decline. That's interesting. Mexico, much more moderate. And here you can see for the same countries the increase in the top 10%. Of course, the top 1 is included in the top 10 and maybe driving the results. But we see that wealth shares for the top 1 have increased quite substantially in the last 6 to 7 years. So this is intended to complement the data on income and get a broader picture of what has happened with the overall inequality situation. Outside Latin America, big numbers are observed. Czech Republic, in 25, in Italy. The UK, 10.5% is not small. Okay. And perhaps here, the other. In Europe, the OECD, and here we can look at also what in austerity countries, in countries that have taken austerity policies in the post-2008 period. In Greece, in Italy, in Ireland, in Portugal, Spain. And we do the same computation for those countries. And you see, in Greece, the wealth remember this is wealth share, not income share, of the top 1% increased by almost 42%. In a country that gross domestic product declined by some 26-27% over the same time period. So you have an economy that's shrinking and wealth is going to the top at the same time. Yes?
So I find it interesting that these countries are considered austerity countries, because certainly in Canada and the US there was much more significant quantitative easing measures and stimulus in the economy than in Europe. And you can see there, interestingly, Canada and the US have negative percentile growth of that share, and Japan as well. And I wonder if that should be associated with some of those austerity measures that took place, or lack of austerity measures.
You would say that there was no austerity in the country with quantitative easing?
Well, in both Canada and the US, there were large stimulus packages right after the recession. In fact, in Canada, we didn't really have a recession on the scale elsewhere. And in the US, I mean, there was the massive, I don't remember the exact amount of billions.
13 trillion.
Yes.
Exactly. So I think the question of saying it says, I find it interesting that certainly there's a different scale of austerity in those countries. I'm just wondering what are your thoughts on, it could be, I don't know, maybe it's not austerity at all.
Quantitative easing is the opposite. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I would say, well, I would make a distinction here, and it's in the table, between core economies, Canada, France, Germany, US, and the European periphery, where the austerity program have been
But if you know, even within the core economies, there seems to be a link there between the austerity measures, the countries that did have austerity measures and the ones that didn't.
Yes.
Because the US and Canada, again, didn't have
Yes. Yeah, I think it's, well, now, this is a tricky point, and I think that there's still several puzzles here. In countries that there was quantitative easing, asset prices have increased much more sharply than in countries that didn't implement austerity. In part because there was more liquidity in the economy, banks and corporations had more liquidity, and in a recessionary or stagnationist environment, firms did not use the money to increase private capital formation or increase physical investment. So they invested in stocks, in bonds, in mutual funds, or banks lend the money outside the country. Part of the quantitative easing didn't stay inside this economy, but went outside to emerging economies, emerging countries, to buy assets there, lend. Yeah, I would say that perhaps there is the sort of correlation that you mentioned. I think that's true. But here it's important to see what has happened with asset prices. In general, the share of the top 1% or the top 10% is positively correlated. I don't have the chart here, but that correlation exists between the ratio of stock market prices to housing. Okay, because stock market tend to be more stocks tend to be a higher proportion of wealth, of upper wealth groups compared with the rest, whereas housing is more equally distributed. So if the ratio between the price of stock versus the price of housing goes up, in general, the wealth share of the top 10%, top 5, top 1 goes up. That doesn't square very well with the fact that we observe that in the US, the UK is, I would say, significant, but the US, the decline in the top of the wealth share of the top 1%. But I think it would be an interesting topic for further research, the link between asset prices and the wealth share of the top 1%.
And interest rates might play a role as well, right? I mean, quantitative easing would tend to bring interest rates down, whereas austerity very explicitly brings
interest rates up. Yes. The fact is that when interest rates go down, asset prices go up. So it goes in the same direction. You have to do the quantitative easing, increase the supply of money or the monetary base by the central bank. You decrease interest rates and the price of stocks and financial assets go up. And that shows up partly in the wealth share of the group that have those assets. Yeah, but I leave the point for you to further reflection.
That's interesting.
But I think it's the stylized fact is still it remains to be explained why in this country that the economy has shrunk very strongly, like let's say Spain and Greece. Italy is different because austerity in Italy was not as tough as the other country was still the top went higher the size of the cake. Why in these countries the income share of the top wealth holders increased so sharply? Maybe related to privatizations of assets at low prices, that could be part of the story. And also because of the fact that housing prices have remained particularly depressed in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain, whereas stock market have not boomed, but they have not declined as sharp as the other. So I would say, if you want to study this issue further, look at asset prices and housing prices, and look at the shares and try to see what happened with the macroeconomy, quantitative easing, growth of GDP. In general, the story of the post-2008 period has been slow growth in the core economies and of negative growth in the European periphery, low investment, very weak recovery of investment, but asset prices have recovered much faster, particularly stocks and bonds. Okay, because we are running out of time, let me try to pull out some interpretation of this data, global trends in inequality and the situation in Latin America. Now there are some peculiarities in Latin America that make it different compared with the global evolution of inequality. I would like to highlight a few factors that particularly explain, in my view, to some extent, the polarization in the social structure and the fact that we have the coexistence of, in several countries, economic elites that have become more rich, and the diminished situation and the weakened situation of the working class and the lower middle class. On the upper part of the distribution, factors of income and wealth concentration, I would say, highlight privatization. Particularly when you privatize state-owned assets in a recession, in a period in which the price of those assets are depressed, those that have liquidity to acquire those assets can make a big capital gain. That's happened in Russia, that's happened in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, that's happened in Chile in the 1980s, that happened in the UK probably the last 20 years or 25 years. There is in general, privatization tend to be correlated with the concentration of wealth at the top, tend to be. The other is that if you take a long period of time, 25, 30 years, most of the countries have lowered their top income tax rates. That started with Thatcher, with Reagan, and other countries follow through. Okay? So here we're talking about the pre-tax income share. Of course, if the tax rate is lower, the income tax, the tax share of disposable income will go down. So we're talking that the pre-tax income share went up when taxes went down, but the marginal tax rate went up. Well, third factor I just mentioned in passing, high CEO compensation. Okay, firms, owners, board of directors, in the last 20 years, 25 years, designed a completely different pay structure for top managers because they wanted to align the interests of the owners with the behavior of the managers. And basically they reduced the component of fixed salaries and increased the variable component in compensation, coming from stock market options, profit share mechanisms, bonuses and all that, perks, super pension funds, golden handshakes, private airplanes. So these three measures, these three things, privatization, lowering top income tax rate, high CEO compensation packages, go in a way to explain the increase in the economic importance of the top 1% and elites. Then, this issue has been studied comparatively less, in my view, is market concentration and monopolization. Economic conglomerates in many economies have become more important because of economical scale, economy of scope, globalization, etc. There is a tendency, and numbers from the United Nations UNCTAD, they publish a publication of transnational corporations, multinational corporations, show an increasing importance of transnational corporations in economic structure in many countries. And that, I think, is connected. On the other part of the distribution, factor connected to the decline in labor shares, deunionization, the percentage, the density of the labor union membership has declined in the last 25 years in many European countries. You can see that in the statistics. Immigration from emerging economies, from former socialist countries, etc. Though the effect on wages perhaps is not spectacular, has contributed, because of increasing the supply of labor, to keep wages from increasing too much. Okay, that probably has helped to reduce labor shares, immigration. Also very important, outsourcing of production to low-wage countries. Okay, that's clearly a reduction in the demand for labor in high-wage countries, and increasing because corporations go to China, go to Vietnam, go to countries in Asia, some to Mexico, etc. Labor-saving technical progress, of course, because of IT, technology, etc. So all these factors, I think, account for some polarization in the change of income, or the social structure and income distribution. In Latin America, the story, these factors also have operated to a different degree. But in Latin America, the story of the last 10 years, 12 years, is somewhat different. Because in Latin America, the region experienced a bonanza in terms of trade and commodity price increases up to 2012, more or less. The education expansion that has reduced wage premiums, and targeted social policies to low-income groups. These factors may in some way go in the direction explaining the decline in the Gini. Probably the Gini underestimates the overall distribution of income because it is underrepresented the top. But still there has been an improvement in income distribution, let's say for the bottom 90%, or for the bottom 40%, because of cash transfer programs in Brazil, Bolsa Familia, Oportunidades in Mexico, Chile Solidario in Chile, etc., have increased income, disposable income at the bottom of the distribution. And that's probably explaining why part of the improvement in income distribution is real. I think it underestimates at the top, what is happening at the top, but perhaps at the bottom, something of this is going on. And also the fact that education, the wage premiums, there are some studies that show the wage premiums have declined. Okay? And this has been attributed to education, to change in education programs. Okay? Factors more of the structural nature that go in the opposite direction is the fact that tax collection, though it has improved, the tax ratios have increased in Latin America, they are still well below international standards. So income distribution after the fiscal policy, the correction by fiscal policy, still unequal because fiscal policy, though making progress, has not been enough to correct inequalities in the primary distribution of income. I think that's very important. Okay, just to finish very telegraphically, what can be done to reduce inequality, both in Latin America and everywhere in the world? Is it like thinking ahead, thinking aloud, what we can do to reduce inequality? Because we are concerned about inequality and they say, well, okay, you have presented all this data, you have convinced us that the situation is worse than in the past. Well, what do you propose to do? Okay, well, it's a fair question. I would say the following. First, recognize that inequality is a problem. It seems like an obvious statement, but it's not that obvious because many governments, when they set up economic and social policies or public policies in general, many governments don't put as an explicit objective or target of their policies to reduce inequality. Even if you go to the Millennium Development Goals, the first wave, okay, 2015, there is nowhere there is something providing drinkable water, like 35 list. It's a long list of goals, social goals, but nowhere it appeared reducing income inequality or wealth inequality. Now with the post-2015 goals, to see a change in that direction. Okay? So I think it's very important to recognize that this is a problem. The other is redistributing income and wealth, particularly, is very tricky, both economically and politically. You don't want to penalize too much private investment, you don't want the private sector to go to strike and say, well, okay, I don't want to live in this country, I will take my capital out of this country because they are taxing me too much, or they're putting policies that are unfriendly to capital, so I can put the economy in a stagnation trap. Okay? So it's very important to avoid the blockade of the elites of any attempt to improve income distribution. And we observe that in Chile with tax reform, we observe that in many countries. Even in Europe, François Mitterrand in the early 80s had to do a U-turn. He started with a nationalization policy, active income redistribution, and the third year he said, no, it's impossible, I cannot govern, this economy will not stand redistribution and nationalization in a global world. Though globalization was not as important as it is today, but for a country in the central of Europe, it was impossible to have higher taxes, nationalize companies, redistribute income, even in that he was a socialist. So, and we see many countries that it has not been possible to redistribute income. So, you have to manage economically and politically the issue. The other point, you need to some degree mobilize middle class support and working class support for redistribution. Perhaps not in a very confrontational way with elites, because elites have a lot of power. They control the media, they control the money to finance political campaigns, they can bribe senators, they can bribe MPs, they can bribe everybody, they own the mass media, they can do all sorts of things. So you may start with a very candid objective of improving income distribution, and the 2 years they make your life almost impossible as a government. So watch that you have the middle class and the working class behind you if you want to embark on income redistribution or wealth distribution. Very important. The other is keep the economy growing. Distributive conflict is, if the economy is growing, it's very different if the economy is shrinking, like in Greece, like in Portugal, like in Spain, that it's much more difficult for the government to raise revenues, to spend in social programs, etc. If the economy is contracting rather than if the economy is growing. So it's very important to keep the economy growing. In the Latin American case, revise the level of and the composition of taxation and raise direct taxation, the level of direct taxation, the contribution to total revenue, very important. The wealth tax, something to be discussed. Control tax evasion and tax havens, something of that. The OECD has a couple of initiatives to reduce tax evasion and start to put a hold on tax havens. The US arranged with the Swiss government for Swiss banks to report to the IRS of the US any US citizen that has an account in Switzerland. Okay, because there is a suspicion that these people that did not declare that income to the IRS, therefore they are not complying with the law, and they owe the tax rate. The other is to look at the wage setting process, institutions, social policies, concentration of wealth, public ownership versus privatization. It's a big topic. I just want to highlight it. Okay, well, this is the presentation. The idea was to discuss some trends of income distribution, the social structure at the global level, place Latin America in that context, show the peculiarities of the Latin American situation, and also warn you that It's like tobacco, when you smoke and you go and buy tobacco, say smoking can be bad for your health, using household survey data can be damaging for the accuracy of your inequality analysis. Use tax data is not the panacea. It will also evade taxes and the report, etc. But it's less serious than with household survey. And we show that the alleged improving income distribution may not be that important once we use the correct data in Latin America. Still, I think there has been an improvement. And also look at not always income, but take a look at wealth. What has happened with wealth distribution? The story can change quite substantially because wealth tends to be much more unequally distributed than income. And then, if you want see what creative ideas you have to turn the world from a very unequal place to a more equal place and survive in this.
Thank you, Professor Solimano. We have a few minutes for some questions if you want to ask Professor Solimano.
Don't leave the room because
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the studies you mentioned on market concentration and monopolization and how they contribute to inequality. What are the rough findings of those studies?
yes. Do you want to collect some questions or
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks for the talk. So I was wondering, you focus very much on fiscal measures to reduce inequality. Do you think for Latin American countries there's also room for using monetary policy to reduce inequality?
Okay.
I was wondering, I understood you to say that part of the lower trend or like less significant trend in the decline of inequality that you observe for Latin America would be explained by the difference between tax data and household service. But isn't the tendency of people to underestimate their wealth when they are being asked in a household survey kind of a constant factor? So how could this, like, so in order for this to explain that the trend is actually less sharp than we can observe it, there would need to be a change in the attitude towards reporting, right?
Yes. Okay.
So this is my first question. My second question, if I may, on the middle class, I'm wondering whether it wouldn't be also interesting to, I mean, if we take class as a concept that is based on the sources, the kind of sources of income, wouldn't it be also interesting to take this into consideration in some ways? Because then we might get a different story on why the middle class is developing the way it is developing.
Okay. Thank you. Let me turn to the question of the studies. Yes, I would suggest you to go to this global investment report of UNCTAD. It's based in United Nations Conference on Trade Development. They are based in Geneva, in Switzerland. They publish a yearly report on international corporation. I think it's investment report or multinational corporation report. I'm not completely sure on the title. But then you will see the importance of the 500, the largest 500 companies in the world, and the composition, etc. And they tend to show that the share of sales or production of these top 500 companies in total production has increased. And then they use some market concentration indices that also show a tendency to monopolization or oligopolization of markets. I connect that to the fact that monopoly companies, monopolies, oligopolies tend to have higher profits than a competitive, than a firm in a competitive market. Therefore, that tends to increase the capital share and worsen income distribution. That would be more or less the main connection between that and inequality. Your question was more on the fiscal system, but you said why not?
So you focused on fiscal measures for reducing inequality.
Right.
And I was wondering whether you saw room for using monetary
fiscal
tools for reducing inequality.
Okay, monetary tools. Yes, that's a good question. I would say, well, fiscal policy in the sense, well, the typical Philip Musgrave three functions fiscal policy was stabilization, redistribution, I think the third was correction, externality, something. The fiscal policy more on the side of redistribution, taxes and transfer, how they affect. But your point would be more using from the point of view of macroeconomic stabilization or stimulus, to what extent it can also improve income distribution. Well, the experience has been so far that a loose monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy through quantitative easing, has been relatively ineffective, in producing a rapid rebound of the economy that would improve employment and improve income distribution through that mechanism. Because of the fact that firms use the extra liquidity to acquire assets, either at home and abroad, but not invest in physical capital, machines, equipment, and all that. They tend to go more to financial assets. That move also tend to be regressive from one point of view of the distribution of wealth, because those that can engage in buying financial assets are upper income or upper wealth brackets. Okay, the middle class, in general, the share of financial assets in total wealth of the middle class, let's say from 40% to 90% is fairly small. All studies show that, and take them north in the US and some studies from the UK show that. I also have data for Chile and South Africa, and it's more or less the same pattern. I tend to be skeptical that monetary policy in a big recession or stagnationary context can either pull the economy out of the recession and improve income distribution. I think fiscal policy could be more appropriate. But the problem is that OECD countries tried Keynesian expansion 2009-2010, and then the G20 and the main economies decided to switch toward policy to reduce the fiscal deficit, control public debt, etc., and sacrificing and increasing acceleration in growth and all that. So fiscal policy without those constraints perhaps would have been more effective than monetary policy. That's what you can think. Now, the first question was on the definition of the second question was on the definition of the middle class and the class. The first one?
The first one was, I mean, you had this graph.
Okay, the systematic underestimation. Okay.
So why would this change over time? Why would the systematic underestimation change?
Yeah, sure. No, I think it's a fair point. I think there are two issues. One is of levels of inequality, in which if you use tax data, it's different than if you use household data. Then the trend, the evolution, the change. Okay, if the underreporting is more or less constant over time, that would not change the evolution. Now, these studies, the Uruguay study, the Brazilian study, the Mexican study that I showed there, tend to show that the Gini and the share of the top 1% has remained more or less stable in the last 5 to 10 years, whereas using household surveys, the tendency for those shares to decline and the Gini to decline more sharply. So it's not clear that the hypothesis is just the hypothesis that the rate of underreporting is constant over time. It may have changed. Definitely will affect the levels. The change will depend on the rate of, to what extent the rate of underreporting change or has changed or not. Now, the second question, definition of class. Yeah, I think that's a very old theme, it's almost intractable. No, in the sense that you cannot say all definitions of social classes and social segments have some degree of arbitrariness invalid. But I would say the measures, I mean, defining economic elites with the income share and wealth share of top 5%, top 1%, top 0.1 is not particularly controversial. It's something that we can say you can find some other measure, but in general it works. The middle class is more tricky in the sense that if you cut at 90%, if you cut at 80%, if you cut at 40%, if you cut at 30%, yes, there are no clear solutions to that. Perhaps you can try different definitions and see how it works. The middle class is a kind of majority class. By living outside the rich and the poor, everybody else is middle class. There are income measures, there are percentile measures, there are subjective self-evaluation, self-classification methods. There is a whole literature on how to measure the middle class. But in general, the fact that the middle class has become more heterogeneous, more fragmented, more polarized within the middle class is relatively well established. And then for the working class or the poor, working class, if we stretch out the definition that anybody that makes a living out of a wage and enters in a contract with some hierarchical, it's part of a hierarchy and responsibility and has to comply with hours and report to somebody. The size of the middle class can be much larger, not much larger than what we think. I think still using labor shares is a good way to see what has happened from the point of view of income distribution between capital and labor. Okay, so let me say that I don't think it's a big problem to use labor shares to approach what has happened with the working class. The middle class is more tricky. The elites or the top income groups, top wealth, is more reasonable. In general, I think these three stylized factors I highlighted tend to be relatively robust to different definitions. It's very difficult to say that income has not concentrated at the top or wealth, that the labor share has increased whereas all the evidence is showing that it's declining. Any other question or comment?
Yes. So taxation seems to be like the big problem in Latin America. So I was wondering, is that purely political problem in the sense that elites are blocking the rising of taxation, especially direct taxation, or is it also a matter of state capacity in the sense that maybe states, even if there was the political will, don't have the logistical capacity to go to assess income and collect income?
Yes, I think probably the reasons are both. Politically, it's difficult to pass legislation that increases tax rates too much, because the elites and the establishment, so to speak, will block that. That has been observed in many countries. And also economically, you cannot increase too much all of a sudden corporate income, corporate tax rates, or personal income tax rates. Some countries have chosen a more gradual path, etc. But there is room for discussion on that. But I think if we want to improve income distribution, we have to move in that direction. These personal income tax rates and corporate rates to some extent. But yes, I think there is a problem also of the institutional capacity of the state. Then let's assume the legislation put forward by the government is approved by Congress. Okay, you have the legislation. Then to what extent the government will really collect higher taxes, about control tax evasion, control underreporting of incomes. The other problem that is very serious in Latin America is the informal sector. There's a big chunk of the economy that does not pay taxes.
I was thinking especially on the Argentina case, which has been a left-wing course, right? Left-wing government for the last 10 years.
Yes.
This has changed in the recent days, but
yes.
But the share of the top 1% is huge. It's among the highest in Latin America.
Yes. Yes, but still Argentina Let me see if I have the figure here. Total tax revenue to GDP in Argentina is among the highest in Latin America, still with all the programs of tax evasion. Also Brazil, 35%, 31%. The weighted average in Latin America is 21.3%. Still, the popular belief is that in Argentina there is a lot of tax evasion, particularly by the very rich. And not only in Latin America, in Argentina, in other countries as well. Yeah, that's a problem. No, yeah, I agree with you that it's not just a matter that the elites block you pass legislation, to pass legislation moving to higher taxation, but the fact that governments do not have full capacity to collect higher taxes, even if Parliament approves higher tax rates. And also the size of the informal sector. The informal sector is important in doing that.
Just to add to that, in the case of Ecuador, had a recent experience recently. We're just trying to moderately increase the estate tax, because we knew nothing else was feasible politically. And the middle class allied with the elites and created massive protests against the increase of the estate tax. So sometimes you also have that dynamic where the middle class ideologically feels like maybe they will eventually become the elite, so therefore they don't want any tax increases.
Yeah,
That will benefit them.
yeah, I think that's a very good point. Many times the elites manage to mobilize the middle class, play also on the fears of the middle class, that they will tax your home, or you will be like in Argentina with Cristina Fernandez, capital controls. You want to travel abroad, you cannot get more than $50 per day at the official rate. Some people think that it's being taxed in that. Also, corporate taxes, many times big employers associations say, well, this will affect the small and medium-sized enterprises. So the middle class many times gets mobilized against an increase of taxation. That would benefit them also through the expenditure side. But they are afraid that they will tax on assets that they do hold, like housing, or small, medium-sized firms, foreign exchange controls. Yeah, well, you have to be careful on that. And in Latin America, the history of Latin America has been plenty of those foreign exchange controls and things like that that affect the middle class. Not so much on housing, I think. It's a mix of economic and political manipulation, in the sense that many times the elite plays on the fears of the middle class to form a bloc against higher taxation. Now, I don't believe that all redistribution has to be done through taxation. You have also to see how the critical markets and critical areas in social policy work, like education system, the wage setting process, the structure of markets, which are not directly fiscal issues. If you have better, stronger union, but reasonable unions that can distribute productivity gains more evenly between capital and labor, will improve income distribution. If you have market structures that are not too much monopolized, you also will improve income distribution. If you have a good public education system, that everybody has access, that is not very expensive, the fees for students are not high, and the quality of education is good, that also should improve income distribution. And also the distribution of assets. In Latin America, land up to the 1960s, in many countries was the main source of wealth concentration because the latifundio and structure. Now in the last 30, 40 years, it's more the ownership of financial assets and the ownership of physical capital is more concentrated. Yeah, wealth is also very important. The distribution of wealth is very is a very important issue. I think privatization has gone in the direction of concentrating more wealth. It's a new trend. And also the fact that financial markets have been booming in many countries also contribute to increase the wealth, because the wealthy have more financial assets than the non-wealthy. So a comprehensive analysis of inequality has to look at income, key markets, and the fiscal part, and also wealth. I think you have to consider those two dimensions.
Okay, Professor Solimano, thank you so much. Thank you so much, and I hope I'll see you guys on February with Professor Gabriel Palma on the economic history of Chile. So thank you guys, and thank you again.